As Jeff said, this Nettle's a project I began a while ago now, but we just recently released this album, which I have here actually, called El Resplendor, The Shining in Dubai. And actually, I have to give a shout out because the inspiration came from Jeff at one of the Postopolis events in Los Angeles. Someone had just given a presentation on Dubai, and Jeff made a kind of offhand joke that every 15 or 20 years, how the big movies get remade, you could remake The Shining and set it in Dubai, which I thought, of course, was like a brilliant idea, and it really stayed with me. And one thing I've DJed quite a bit in Dubai, and one of the sort of the foremost facts about nightlife in Dubai is that because of alcohol laws and entertainment laws, all the clubbing, all the sort of public nightlife has to happen in hotels. That's the only place where drinking is legal, so that's where the clubs are. They're at a hotel or like on a property adjacent to one. So all of my experiences there were in hotels. It's almost like sort of public nightlife. It's all about hotels. And then thinking of The Shining in Dubai, great. Well, what would that soundtrack be? What would that soundtrack be? And so eventually I decided that this would be the guiding concept for this new album. And as a band, Nettle right now is a 5-piece, but we've performed and we had a whole body of work, built around live performances. That was what it was intended for. And when we would go into studio spaces and try and record our sort of live repertoire, for a CD or for an album, something always went wrong. Like some sort of spark was lost. And fixing on this idea of like, well, let's discard all these songs that we've built, to interact with the crowd and to play with live dynamics, and let's really use this idea of this luxury hotel. The air conditioning's not working, the family's stuck in there, debtor's prison in Dubai. Let's really focus on this idea of place and of what sort of atmosphere this movie would generate, and use that to sort of guide us through, the writing and production of a whole new set of music for it.
And we've talked before just about how the relationship to silence is different when you're performing and when you're recording. For example, when you're performing, you're battling with silence, because the sound, it wants to go to silence and it comes from silence. But if you think about sound as a departure and an arrival in a space, almost like an itinerary, I think it frees up new concepts and new ways of making it.
That's actually quite funny. We first, Lindsay and I, we had a writing residency here in New York City, and this was with the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and so it was in the unused floor of the ninth story in the skyscraper down the financial district, which was very much a Shining in Dubai kind of place. The cubicles have been removed; they're all stacked in one corner.
You could still see the shadows on the floor where they once existed.
And it was this enormous space, 5,000 square feet with 9 writers in our little rooms. And once the concept got underway, we said, okay, well, let's record a vocal track in this space. Let's do it here and sort of channel this bizarre corporate decay moment.
Yeah. But as soon as we set up the mics and we started trying to record, we were listening back to the tracks and we were hearing this buzzing the tracks were unusable because we were in this completely empty floor of a building, but there was so much noise.
Yeah, and in a way it was a noise I like. Like part of the Nettle project is working with acoustic sound, more or less organic sounds, and pulling them towards the digital and towards electronic. But there's a way in which a microphone will amplify the space, will amplify all the sort of acoustic characteristics of the space you're in. And so, yeah, as Lindsay mentioned, you get the buzzing of the fluorescent tubes, the air, the recycled air that's going throughout, the distant hum of traffic, and all this. There's almost like too much of a presence of that 9th-story building was in the music. So we had to go back to the very sort of silent and hermetically sealed space of the studio.
And then add buzzing.
Yes.
Very carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the sort of bigger picture, I see this album as, it's kind of like our take or our inspiration from the idea of the Gothic, specifically the Gothic and the literary, which I was obsessed with for a while, reading as many ghost stories as I could. And to me, it's this very idea of like the haunted house, the ghost story is so fascinating, from a sort of architectural urbanistic perspective, because it's an explicitly spatial literary format. It's all about the place, the troubled history or the troubled past, but the place as a character in and of itself, and a sort of protagonist in short stories and movies and books. And then I said, and ghosts, ghosts or spirits who haunt a place, I started thinking about this. Essentially, a ghost is a person for whom time is no longer like a motivating factor of their life. They're people caught in a loop. They're people trapped in a building, trapped in the bedroom where the murder happened. And so it's kind of upends the way you're thinking about like a way to tell a story. And to me, that sort of touched over and helped me think about ways to, instead of, as I went about actually writing these songs, instead of focusing on, okay, it's the song with part A and a chorus and a bridge, let's think about this song as a kind of presence inside a space, inside this strange hotel.
Because in a way, a song structure traditionally is very related to time. To meter, to time, to duration. So when you think of it as happening in a sort of time loop and only related to a space, it really changes the compositional approach.
Yeah, absolutely. You start getting into more ideas about, okay, well, let's think about texture. Let's think about putting these sounds in space by adding on layers of reverb and buzzing and stereo field placement. And in a way, the fact that the sort of imaginative concept of doing this remake for the movie, which doesn't yet exist, because it was so strong, it really helped us to jettison all these other ideas of all this live body of work we had, and so in a way it became very, very, very freeing. And I think you needed like this very sort of, okay, The Shining, it's kind of like a cultural touch point for so many people, and then taking a departure from that and really open things up at the moment of writing and recording.
And also working with some members in the band who are from North Africa and don't have those cultural touchstones of The Shining was also interesting to describe to them what the story is, what added a whole other layer and given your...
Yeah, that was great actually. So it's sort of imagining a movie as retold. So I feel like, okay, we're thinking of this one particular scene and this event is going to happen, this tension, and sort of describing The Shining and then describing our extrapolation on The Shining. And all this is sort of folded into, it's one of the interesting things about, we had a long discussion sort of internally with the band about performing in Dubai, and so opportunity arose. And to two of the Moroccans in the band, basically Dubai has a very poor PR in Morocco. It's associated with a lot of sort of people going, spending extravagantly.
Losing their souls.
Yes. And so they're like, anti-Dubai from the start, which had this whole other layer of class tensions and the Arab world on top of things, sort of also present in some of the frictions we're working with.
So Jace and I were talking on the subway yesterday as well about this idea of haunting and whether it's implicitly in our minds attached to old places and old spaces, and what happens when you think about a place like a luxury hotel in Dubai being haunted, or a Walmart, or a Starbucks in Gulf.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, somehow, like that's again, it's very important to the sense of place you get in a situation like Dubai, a world city, 30 years old. Most of the structures can be 10, 15 years old. And thinking about, like, do you need that kind of deep history, this like tragic past, or is it possible to have these kind of very sort of corporate contemporary moments that somehow have a temporal disturbance in them? And to me, it's going a bit further, that sort of touches upon ideas about cyberspace and the internet. You get these very, very, non-places, and can they have these sort of strange presences flitting throughout? And that's one of the, again, saying, in addition to going to Dubai and DJing all these hotels, one of the striking things about the urban landscape there is that it's not even uncanny. Like, oh, this is the Starbucks, this is the Fuddruckers, here are the, sort of like the Texan oil guys, a lot of people speaking English.
And I guess if you can think of haunting as I don't know, in my mind it's somehow related to something that's missing, something that's lost, and then how that is related to new sort of corporate culture, this idea of loss and lack and return to space to find, or related to data or internet or any of this.
Cool. I'd love to just hear the actual sort of the process of making the album, and also if you, which would include things where, did you find that the notion of this being a soundtrack was just kind of stuck on there when it was actually a musical inspiration, or did you find things where you were changing the music because you realized like this is where the kid opens up the shower and finds the dead woman or whatever, you know what I mean? Like where you knew that it had to have some kind of almost like Tim Burton-esque narrative quality. When I say Tim Burton, I just mean the idea of an actual soundtrack. And like, how did you navigate that? Because
yeah, I guess it was less of a scene by scene thing. And there's one, it's funny, a track which didn't make the album, but like, okay, this is the song that's happening inside room 217. You know, this horrible event happens in a very spiky, spooky banjo thing. And that was written from the start, like, okay, this is going to correspond to this particular room, this particular moment. But in general, and actually it's, and there are a few moments like that. You know, there's this wind throughout the book, the Stephen King book, and he's often talking about this like the winds and the wasps. And so I'm thinking, okay, the sea moon is one of these winds in the desert nearby Dubai. I'm like, okay, this is the track that's going to evoke this wind, which is driving the narrator crazy. But at the same time, it wasn't too you know, one-to-one. You know, like this soundtrack isn't, I would love to see some filmic version of this emerge, but the soundtrack I hope is open enough, you know, for some play within that.
as far as that goes, I'm just curious about if is that something that you would want to see literalized? Like, I think it could be totally exciting and weird to see a soundtrack actually turn into a film later. But is that something that you'd like to see, or that you'd like to see more out of novelty, or would it like artistically fulfill the album's promise, or how do you view that aspect of the project?
I think it would be very interesting.
Yeah, and actually there's a filmmaker I've done some work with in the past, Jim Cohen, and he was in Dubai last year and recently has some footage, and I gave him an advance copy of the album, he's really into it, and so he has some footage which he has yet to show me. And I think it'll be very much in the Jim Cohen sort of like this sort of melancholy, passing of time, the very poetic approach, but it could be, he leans away from the narrative, but something like that would be, yeah, very, very exciting to happen.
Yeah, I don't know if it's ever happened. Do you know if that's ever happened before, anybody, where a film has been made?
The classic example I can think of is like how Young Guns was inspired by a Bon Jovi song.
Right.
Or no, Young Guns 2 was inspired by a Bon Jovi song. Dead or Alive.
Yeah.
But yeah, it wasn't a soundtrack.
There's some directors who are inspired through sound, but
there's also the case of there's the one case that I know is the Rejected soundtrack. There's a British band named Coil who was hired to do a soundtrack for Hellraiser. And I guess the guys that made Hellraiser found it so, well, they say, I mean, the legend is that it was so disturbing they wouldn't release it. I think in reality it just didn't fit the movie. But so then the Rejected soundtrack to Hellraiser became this kind of cult item that you can find in certain electronic stores. And so every time you hear it, you know, there's this sense that you're listening to almost like a different version of the film. But yeah, as far as the actual soundtrack preceding the film, I don't think that's happened yet. Keep your fingers crossed.
Yeah.
You mentioned over email just questions of like the Gothic and Gothic spaces, and that touches on what you're talking about as far as like new spaces that are haunted versus old. And I'd just like to just go back to that briefly and just talk about that notion that like you build a place and from the very beginning it's built, it's haunted. And an example of that in pop culture, at least, is Poltergeist, where it's a brand new subdivision that, or if I remember correctly, but it happens to be built on a Native American graveyard. And so the place is very old and it's haunted from the beginning in a sense, and then the house just happens to show up in the wrong place at the wrong time. But then of course there's the very Gothic idea that heavily ornamented spaces that are sagging and off-kilter somehow generate a sense of ghosts and people watching, and it's almost as if an architectural type, which is the Victorian home, generates a sense of haunting. So in any case, I guess I'm just interested in that notion that like a 7-star Dubai hotel could nonetheless, from the day it's open, have some kind of presence inside of it that comes from somewhere. I'm just curious about that idea of Gothic, almost like the international style of Gothic.
Yeah, I think it's in a way it's important that those spaces be able to be haunted in such a strange way. And kind of extrapolating a bit, I think of if we're talking about like the speed of contemporary capitalism, everything's accelerating. I think if you get this moment where the past starts to bleed into the future, so maybe the thing that's haunting the brand new Starbucks built on totally neutral ground is the idea that in 20 years this is going to be a hellish wasteland, totally unsustainable. The sort of future ruins might be what's impinging and haunting place rather than the past. This is my personal extrapolation. I want to mention that the photos, which we have running in the slides, are from Lindsay, an Emirati artist. She was actually the selected artist, the first selected artist to participate in this Biennale from the United Arab Emirates. But this year's called Presences, and this is actually really, really relevant. Pretty early on in the project, I was getting in touch with a bunch of friends in Dubai, saying, okay, who would be appropriate, to sort of get the visual accompaniment to sort of help steer us. And my friends said, we need to talk to Lamia. And this is, as I mentioned, called Presences, and it's all shot in Dubai and Sharjah, like 30 minutes outside of Dubai, and recently abandoned homes, mostly middle-class Emirati families who have left their sort of more 70s structures and moving to like newer developments, condos, sort of upgrading, as it were. And I think it's, touching on your question, I think the mood of hers, there's a certain melancholy and a certain spookiness in these one of the pictures, I don't think it's included in this, but it's just a master bed, and the bed's unmade, and on the wall you can see a patchwork photo or painting had hung, and then there's a Teenage Mutant Ninja Poster sign. And it's once very sort of suburban and mundane, but then also kind of terrifying.
I was curious about, and I'm having never been to Dubai, it's all wild speculation in my head, so I kind of imagine it being haunted by oil, actually. Like oil is this thing that has an end date, like it is a sort of also it seems very kind of like an uncontrollable force that kind of moves through.
And it's underground as well.
Yeah.
It's made of dead, living things that have been dead for a long time.
Yeah, specifically in terms of Dubai, there's actually very little oil there.
That's right.
And so it's like Abu Dhabi has most of the oil. And so like Dubai has, it used to be like a little creek and trading port, and now it's sort of like a wider excavated creek and major, strange new hub for capital. But the oil bit is certainly relevant. It makes you think of this book, Cyclonopedia. Basically, it's a book of sort of speculative philosophy, but written with a fictional framework around it. So it's sort of like a Deleuzian fantasy. But the idea is that oil is a demonic force that's motivating human history, shapeless and formless and very, very evil, and so it's the destruction of mankind, which is sort of compatible with the project.
Cool. Any other questions from the audience, or we can wrap up with some music in the background so you can check out the sounds of the Resplendor.
Lindsay, are the CDs available for purchase here?
Yes, Jace. They're available. Actual physical CDs with these photographs inside.
Oh, great.
Cool. Thanks, guys.